Is it a migraine or do you just want the chicken? You just want the chicken. Oops, sorry. Hey you guys, today I want to talk to you about the symptoms of high cranial pressure versus the symptoms of low cranial pressure and how I can tell the difference in myself. For the last few years, this topic has been like the bane of my existence. Really, ever since I started suspecting that I had a CSF leak, I've been trying to figure out whether my cranial pressure is actually high or actually low, and then it took literally years to find out that it was actually both. And that's why we were so confused. And of course, I also have chronic migraine on top of all of it, so that was just making it even harder to tell what was going on. I already have made a video called The Symptoms of a Migraine Attack, where I divided the symptoms of a migraine into the 4 different stages of a migraine, and that's a POTS alert. Thank you. Thank you very much. And in that video, I touched on how I can tell whether or not I'm in a migraine cycle. So this video, we're gonna try to leave migraine stuff out of it and just talk about high cranial pressure versus low cranial pressure. Look at that face. Do I have a migraine coming? Check. Good boy. Good boy, good check. So a migraine alert, he licks me on the nose. Well, oh, thank you. For a migraine alert, he licks me on the nose, but if he doesn't lick me on the nose, then it means I'm not having a migraine. Right now, I'm just having a POTS alert. Thank you, buddy. I realize. Thank you. Yes, my heart rate is just a little bit high. Let's get to symptoms. So here's the plan. I found a scholarly PDF from some kind of article or who's a what's it that compares the symptoms of high cranial pressure, pseudotumor cerebri, to low cranial pressure to primary headache disorders. The main primary headache disorders are migraine, tension headache, and cluster headaches. That makes up something like 98% of all primary headache disorders. So we'll go through that whole list and the symptoms that it says, and I will elaborate for my own experience. And then I also made this sheet on my own, where when I knew I was in high cranial pressure, I made a list of the symptoms I was having, and when I knew I was in low cranial pressure, I made a list of the symptoms that I was having. And I tried to make it symptoms that were more unique to being in that condition. And then finally, disclaimer, grain of salt warning. I'm not a doctor, I'm just a patient. I'm reading lists off the internet. I cannot guarantee that these things are valid. I can't guarantee that anything that I'm saying is valid because I've never had a lumbar puncture. This is all just me making best guesses. I'm making what I would call reasonably educated guesses, but these are just guesses. Please use this for your own entertainment, your own education, but don't use this to diagnose yourself, and make sure you talk to your doctor if you suspect that you have anything. Disclaimers aside, we're ready for our first symptom. Starting with the location of the pain. For pseudotumor cerebri, high cranial pressure, IIH, it says often frontal or retroorbital. So frontal, retroorbital is behind the eyes, but it varies. Of course it varies. In a low pressure situation, it's often posterior, but it varies. Posterior, I looked it up online, usually refers to the base of the skull or the top of the neck. That's oftentimes where you'll get pain for your low pressure symptoms. But again, it says that it varies. What I wrote down for the location of my high pressure headache is that I have an acidic outer. So around my brain, like basically anywhere you can imagine your brain is pushing against your skull, that's where I have my pain when I'm in high pressure. My high pressure headache is way worse than my low pressure headache. High pressure to me feels like it is literally going to explode. It's a huge pressury feeling, and it feels like acid. It burns. With the low pressure headache, by the time I get pain with the low pressure, it tends to be a line at the top of my head. Neck pain and neck stiffness totally does happen with the high pressure headache, but it feels like a tense neck. Versus the low pressure, I tend to get the pain lower down in between my shoulder blades. And when the neck pain comes, it's because the weight of my brain is pushing down slowly, and it's causing my neck to get tired over the course of the day. There are a couple of things I want to add to help you imagine this. Let's start with the high pressure. If you imagine your brain and your spinal column as a balloon that's full of water or full of brain fluid, your brain is inside there floating happily for a normal person. When you have a high pressure headache, that balloon is extra full and it's extra tight, extra stiff, and that makes your neck physically feel extra stiff. That's the feeling of the high pressure for me. Whereas when you get that low pressure headache, you are losing fluid, and that's actually making your neck perceive your brain as heavier than it was when it had fluid. You know that everyone is lighter in the water, you're buoyant in the water. It's the same thing with your brain, and that's one of the main things that your brain fluid does for your brain. It holds it up. It keeps it light so that your neck muscles aren't so tired. But when you're in that low pressure zone, it starts to sag and you start to lean forward, and it's very classic to get neck pain from doing that a lot. Like I said, my high pressure headache is way worse than my low pressure, so there are a couple more notes that I wrote about the characteristics of the pain when I think I'm in high pressure. I wrote acid pain and sunburn skin. Literally, like my skin feels like it has a sunburn. It's just very sensitive to the touch, and especially on my cheeks, from my cheekbones to my inner ear. Oftentimes I also get pain in my temples and my right eyebrow. I'll kind of get trigeminal pain, but it really does kind of localize up here. Oftentimes it is mostly right-sided, but it does usually become full head pain. What I do about my high pressure headaches, now that I'm no longer taking Diamox, is I go to fascial counterstrain. I did used to go to Nuka, but fascial counterstrain fixes the root cause of what Nuka was fixing. So if you haven't seen my 5-part video series on everything from like the pachymeningeal enhancement and what I think is going on with that, and the chain of events that brought me to Nuka and fascial counterstrain, that's a 5-part thing. I will try to remember to link it below. One more thing, when I'm in high pressure, it feels good to give counter pressure. So having my husband actually physically squeeze my head is a good feeling for me. Things are gonna start to get fun because it's very hard to tell the difference between these two headaches. As for timing, the timing of a high pressure headache tends to be worse in the morning, or there's no timing situation. That kind of makes sense because you're laying down all night, so it has time to build up in your head. Whereas with the low pressure headache, it tends to get worse as the day progresses. Migraine can kind of do whatever it wants. So for me, I wake up really bad in the morning, I'm kind of decent in the middle of the day, and then I'm worse again at the end of the day. So I was following the pattern of literally both types of headache. For me, what I believe is happening is in the morning, I am waking up in high pressure. I think that it slowly drains as my sinuses and all of this stuff, maybe the pachymeningeal enhancement, is all able to drain and loosen and relieve that pressure. I can physically feel it coming down through my face, out my neck, or I can feel it behind my ear and out of my neck. Again, that's all in that fascial counterstrain video. And so that's why I believe that that horrible high pressure stuffiness feeling that I feel often in the mornings is most likely high pressure. If I sleep on a wedge or if I sleep with a soft cervical collar on, then I tend to not wake up feeling that bad. And that's further evidence that I am waking up in high pressure. A low pressure headache or a CSF leak getting worse over the day obviously makes sense because you are upright and your fluid is leaking out. We've talked plenty about leaks. I think you guys understand the dynamics of that by now. Another thing related to timing is nocturnal awakening. According to this paper, it can happen with both high and low brain pressure. With high pressure, I think it happens because you're laying down and the pressure builds up, so then it hurts and it wakes you up. But with low cranial pressure, who knows why? Who knows why you're waking up in the middle of the night? But it can happen with either. One thing I find very interesting is the effects of caffeine. I have a very distinct headache that caffeine helps with, and that is my low pressure headache. This is one of those weird things that I figured out instinctively before I even knew that leaks were a thing, but like there's this distinct headache that I get that caffeine will help. On the other hand, sometimes when I wake up in high pressure, I will take that first sip of coffee and literally physically feel a zing. That zing means, okay, stop drinking the coffee because this is gonna give you a slamming headache. Later on, I learned that caffeine helps with low cranial pressure. Caffeine helps raise your cranial pressure. So if caffeine helps, you're most likely in low pressure. The next category is whether or not the headache worsens with the Valsalva maneuver, exercise, or bending over. I think the Valsalva maneuver was like you go and you push and you see what happens to your headache? I don't remember. I've never done it. I'm too afraid to. But the answer to that category for both types of headache is yes. Orthostatic changes can affect both types of headache. So for me, avoiding all types of orthostatic changes have helped a lot with everything, with just regulating everything. So let's talk about what it's like for me to be up and about with high cranial pressure. Usually with the high cranial pressure, I can hear my heartbeat in my head. If I start moving or exercising, I'm going to hear that even more. Sounds tend to be really disorienting for me, and especially if I hear sounds coming from multiple different directions, it can be physically dizzying for me, and that is more of a high pressure thing for me. But that said, I have relatively good orthostatic tolerance when I'm in high cranial pressure. I'll still have some bouts of palpitations, but for the most part it leans more toward POTS and less toward OH, or orthostatic hypotension. What I mean by that is when I'm in high cranial pressure, I have more POTS. When I stand up, my heart rate goes up super, super high, but I'm not very likely to faint. My blood pressure usually doesn't drop, and I don't usually get super lightheaded. When I'm in low cranial pressure, that's when I'm actually at risk of fainting. You guys may remember when I was new to this, before I was talking about high and low cranial pressure because I never knew anything about it, I was talking about POTS, and I was specifically saying that sometimes I'm POTSy and sometimes I'm not POTSy. I was saying sometimes I have more of the POTS symptoms and sometimes I fall more toward orthostatic hypotension, which is a drop in blood pressure without the high rate in heart rate, or without the high spike in heart rate. So it's just interesting the way that the heart is reacting to the two different fluctuations of cranial pressure. Unfortunately for me, what it means is whether I'm going from laying to sitting, or sitting to standing, or especially laying to standing or standing to laying, I'm just not gonna have a very good time with the transition. What helps me is taking it very slowly. I go from laying to sitting for a few minutes, and then sitting, I can stand up, and vice versa. And I try hard not to roll over too many times when I'm going to sleep, because even that can mess up my head. I want to talk a little bit more about the positional component. I hate the positional component. If I ever uttered the words, I can't really tell whether I match the symptoms of high cranial pressure or the symptoms of low cranial pressure. The number one question that I got in response to that was, well, are your symptoms better when you're flat? You guys have probably gotten that question too. It's so hard to tell if your symptoms are better when you're flat. And this probably isn't the answer that you want to hear. But if you can't really tell if your symptoms are better or not when you're flat, it's because you're not staying flat long enough. You have to really commit. In fact, when I first started getting evaluated for a CSF leak, one of the very first things that they had me do was a 48-hour flat test. Baby A was only 3 or 4 months old at the time, and I vlogged the whole thing and stuck it on my channel. Here's a card. But long story short, before that, anytime I laid down, I would have a headache. And then I would stand back up, and I would still have a headache. And I really wasn't able to tell that there was any kind of positional component. I just always had a headache. It turns out it kind of just takes your body some time to adjust when you do your positional change. And a lot of us don't have the luxury in our everyday lives to just stay upright for a few hours or stay laying down for a few hours and really truly think about what our symptoms are doing. But for me, simply trying to go by the amount of head pain that I felt when I was vertical versus horizontal was not anywhere close to being able to help me with determining whether or not I was in high or low cranial pressure. It basically did nothing for me. The number one thing that probably helped me outside of doing the formal flat test was actually filming myself when I was vertical versus filming myself when I was horizontal. When I started watching the footage back, I was like, oh wow, every single time I sat up, I was having a ton of trouble talking. But every time I laid down, all of the thoughts came flooding back. Of course, when I'm in high cranial pressure, that's not gonna happen. Every time I lay down, if I'm in high cranial pressure, I'm gonna have a pulsing, throbbing headache. But unfortunately, if I also had a confounding leak, then laying down could help my cognition. So do you see how this was all getting kind of squirrely? Now that I've figured out that fixing the kink in my neck keeps my cranial pressure from going too high, I've been able to weed out what symptoms are high versus what symptoms are low. I've touched a little bit on pulsatile tinnitus and just generally hearing your heart rate when you're in high cranial pressure. That kind of feels like a logical thing, right? You have too much fluid, it's all pushing against your inner ear. You're hearing that blood pulsing through the veins right next to your ear. Now, you can also have ringing in your ears. That is pulsatile, where it's actually a but it's going I usually only have that when I'm laying down, but that is only a high pressure thing. Now in low pressure headache, you can also get tinnitus, but it's usually not pulsatile. Usually with low pressure, it's just hee, it's flat. Not flat like my singing voice, but flat like not pulsing. Got it? It's first grade. You've got this. Let's talk about transient obscurations of vision. With IIH, common. With low pressure, no. Now, I take that to mean little spots in your vision and stuff like that. For me, if I see spots in my vision and I'm not expecting a migraine, 100% that means I'm having a high pressure time. When I'm in low pressure, if I have spots in my vision, that means that it's a migraine aura, and that is not something that's with my CSF leak. That just means that a migraine cycle got triggered, and now I'm going through that migraine cycle at the same time. Now, depending on how long those vision changes last, and whether or not the vision changes are postural, will change based on what type of headache you have. So for the migraine aura, it's gonna be a 5 to 60 minutes, usually sits there or grows kind of an aura. With the high pressure headache, it's usually like I look to the side and there are spots. Or I'm just kind of like talking to someone and I look over a little bit, spots. Or I cough and there are spots. So very, very different. Postural and activity related versus with the migraine aura, I mean, you're just gonna have the aura no matter what you do. And I don't think I've had visual stuff happen with the low pressure that I remember. And while we're talking about eyeball stuff, papilledema. Papilledema is when your ocular nerve in the back of your eye is pushing against the back of your eye, and then when your eye doctor does an eye exam, they can see that your brain pressure is too high because there's blurring on the edges of that nerve on the back of your eye. Papilledema is usually present with high cranial pressure, but it's not always present. And I do have it. So isn't that weird for a leaker? But it's because sometimes I was in high cranial pressure. Go figure. Both of these conditions are more common in females. With high cranial pressure, it usually happens to women after puberty. With low cranial pressure, it's more common in females, but it's not necessarily tied to puberty. For high pressure, it's usually in obese patients, and for low pressure, it's usually in slim to normal patients. Of course, there are exceptions to all of these rules. These are just the things that are more common, definitely not requirements. Just a couple more things and I will get out of your hair. I wrote down on my list here that on my high pressure days, I usually end up drippy and I am migrainey later. You guys know about my nose drip, that little tick, tick, tick that happens every once in a while, usually out of my right nostril. So that is pretty exclusively a high pressure time thing to have happen. And it's interesting because I put migrainey in quotation marks, and I think I meant that to be brain foggy or cognition issues, because I certainly did not mean to be migraine gen here. I would have said I just turned into migraine gen. I think that migraine gen more closely resembles low CSF pressure gen, but there's a lot of overlap and crisscrossy there. And then one more big huge thing about low pressure gen. Low pressure me is the kind of stuff that I just can't push through. When I'm in high cranial pressure, it's huge, intense, throbbing pain. Maybe I can't think. The lights hurt, the sounds hurt, but it's just really bad pain. And as long as I can push through that pain, I can keep going. Unfortunately, with the low cranial pressure, it has not been like that for me at all. With the low cranial pressure, if I keep pushing, it keeps worsening. And eventually, that's when I get to my very, very worst symptoms. I learned what my worst symptoms were because before, I didn't know that I was leaking brain fluid. I had no idea that by doing postural changes and keeping up with exercise, I was just worsening things. Now that I know, I'm making better decisions, but back then, there was no way that I could know better. So if I continue to push it while I'm in low pressure, I'm going to worsen. And it's going to worsen bad in my extremities. When I'm in high pressure, the sensation in my extremities is more of a tingling. When I'm in low pressure, the sensation in my extremities is much more of a weakness. Like my limbs are actually turning off and they're extremely heavy or turning to lead. With the high pressure, it's like fire. It's like too much stimulation. It's too much. With the low pressure, it's like water. I'm melting. that's when I'm gonna get the clamminess and the sweats and the physical weakness. Eventually I'll get the tremors and the shakes and those kinds of things. And when I'm in low cranial pressure is also when I have issues with my cold tolerance and turning into a statue. This very unique thing where when I get chilly, I freeze instead of shivering. It's like I attempted to shiver, but I just did the one shiver. Just the one. Whenever I've been doing the convulsion stuff, the seizure-y stuff, the full-on fainting stuff, those things I do attribute to low pressure. And right now I would like to remind you, sorry tripod, that all of this is just guesses. I've never had a lumbar puncture before. This is all just educated guesses. I have one more set of things that I wanted to talk to you about when it comes to low pressure, but before I get to that, I do want to do the disclaimer one more time to remind you that I have never had a lumbar puncture or any kind of formal confirmation of these symptoms. I want to remind you, seriously take this with a grain of salt. Take this with an entire salt rock lamp. I'm just a patient and I'm just guessing. Now, I've been sitting on this video for a really long time because I didn't want to tell you guys things and lead you on false paths. And basically I wanted to make sure that I was sure enough with myself before I shared anything with you. And what gave me the confidence to make this video now, whereas I didn't have the confidence before, was that I got that first epidural blood patch. My body responded really well to getting a blood patch, and then the blood patch wore off, and I went back into these other symptoms. So while the blood patch worked, I was like, holy crap, this is rebound high pressure. I'm 100% sure this is high pressure. Now I know what high pressure symptoms are, for sure. I feel like I actually got confirmation there. And then as it wore off and I turned into those symptoms that I was having before, I was like, oh, well then clearly this is the low pressure symptoms. And I can confirm it now with the way that my body reacts when I make postural changes in response to these feelings. So I'm stoked. So let's get to the very last thing. I want to talk about personality changes and irritability. In the phases of migraine video, I talked about how depression, anxiety, irritability can happen in multiple phases of a migraine. Well, with high and low cranial pressure, you can also have those things happen. When I'm in high cranial pressure, the personality changes that I feel are mostly just being irritable. I feel very annoyed by sounds and lights, smells. I mentioned before, if there are a lot of things going on around me, all of that stuff is really overstimulating to me when I'm in high pressure, and I'm just quite irritable. I'm just not very patient when I have high pressure. Partially because of the pain and partially because things are confusing. I feel like my ability to make decisions, my executive function, is distinctly off when I'm in low cranial pressure in a way that it isn't when I'm in a lot of other headache conditions. I did do a migraine gen versus not migraine gen sorting hat from Harry Potter video. That was a really long video but super popular that showed you the huge personality difference between migraine gen and not migraine gen. Now that was before I knew about pressure differences. So there's a chance I might have been low cranial pressure in that video. But I do feel like low cranial pressure me is much more likely to fall into those migraine gen habits, to get those migraine gen feelings. Migraine gen has very big feelings. That's actually like one of her main things. Migraine gen kind of just feels too big. It's almost in a naive and childlike kind of way. Low pressure me just takes everything way too seriously. Everything seems way too serious. And I'm having trouble right now deciding whether this is more of a low pressure thing or a migraine thing, but I wrote it down on my low pressure list. Who knows? But I'd be curious on your input on that. It's just sort of tricky to sort it all out because that whole migraine gen personality that comes out when I'm in a migraine, as defined by Buddy the service dog giving a migraine alert, that tends to come out a lot also when I'm in low cranial pressure, and I think that that triggered a migraine, but I'm not really sure whether or not that personality happens when I'm in low cranial pressure in the absence of a migraine. And I think maybe that's just the next thing that I have to figure out. So I hope this video helps you sort out your own head. Like I said before, when I first got into this migraine and then this high and low pressure journey, trying to figure out whether or not I was in high or low pressure was the bane of my existence. It's crucial to your diagnostic and treatment plan to be able to sort out what the heck is going on with your symptoms. So I hope that this helped you in some way and didn't just make you more confused. I'll see you guys in the next one. I actually just remembered this in the nick of time because my babysitter leaves in like 5 minutes, but check this out. I was just taking the footage from the camera and putting it on my computer, and I was trying to remember the answer to that question I was stuck on. And I realized when my blood patch was wearing off, between weeks 2 and 4, I was getting low pressure symptoms, but it was not yet triggering my migraines again. You might remember from my recovery video that I stopped having migraines after my blood patch. So, can confirm, the cognitive change was distinctly not migraine gen. And I remember, that was also why I felt so confident suddenly making this video. I keep getting that question, who is migraine gen? Is she leak gen? And I didn't know how to answer it, and I didn't know what I felt confident on and what I didn't feel confident on. And I'm not confident enough to be like, hey, diagnose yourself based on this, because again, I'm not a doctor, I'm just a patient, we're just guessing here. But that brain fog confusion stuff was very different from the migraine gen stuff. Migraine gen, like super lovey-dovey big emotions. The low cranial pressure brain fog was like more of a processing delay. It was more of, I could even tell that things were supposed to be easier to think about than this, but for some reason I just couldn't think about it or decide on things. It was like that. With migraine gen, I'm like lost in the world. I totally don't understand how things work. With low pressure gen, I feel like I can kind of understand things, but I don't have that executive function. It's very subtle. I'll try to pay closer attention to the subtleties there, but that's where I'm at for now. That's what I've got. All right. I'm gonna go let this babysitter go. Bye.